I have always prided myself on being the go very, very fast, get a lot of things done kind of person. One of my favorite compliments used to be, "Oh my God, Nataly, you're like a goddess of multitasking." Whenever I would hear that, my ego was just so happy. I was like, yes, I am doing all the things. And um, I remember hearing the phrase slowing down, and ew, that was for lazy people. And I was not lazy and therefore not for me. Well, 8 years ago, I suffered a really debilitating burnout. And it was actually more than a burnout. I call it a life out. It's like my life force stopped functioning. And it was a very scary, very humbling experience. And it forced me to slow down for, I think, the first time in my life and go on this incredible experience and journey of self discovery. And for the first time in my life, asking myself weird questions like, what feels good to me? Where do I find meaning? What do I want to do? And that was a giant reinvention. It led to reinventing my whole way of being, my career, starting to paint. But it all began with slowing down, which is why I am so excited for my conversation today and my guest, because we're going to talk about the challenges and the beauty of slowing down. And my guest today is someone I have known for, well, we think close to 20 years, but haven't talked to in a while. So I'm doubly excited. And Steve Schlafman is the founder of Downshift. I love saying that name. I just want to
Thank you.
say it is a coaching company that is dedicated to helping high performers slow down through turbulence and transition. And Steve had a really long and successful career in venture capital and resigned very shortly after he made partner and went on his own journey of self-discovery. And I'm excited to talk to him about that because not a lot of people have the courage to resign from a position that is so coveted. So with all that, Steve, welcome to Reinventability.
Good to see you. Finally in the flesh. It's been a long time.
That's right. See, I had to start a new podcast for us to actually start this conversation, which I feel like is a good purpose for that.
Yeah,
It's great to see you. It's great to connect.
likewise.
So let's dive in. Let's actually start right there at what seems to be a big pivot point in your life. So uh, as you described, I was reading on your website and I knew this, but you were at a venture capital firm and you can share with our listeners a little bit about what that is. It's an industry that's a bit amorphous. And you
Yep.
made partner, which is a giant achievement. And then you resigned.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because this was to just give everyone a sense of the time. This was in 2017, early. I want to say it was like January. And all of my partners, there were 5 of them at the time, they gathered me into a room to basically say, hey, we're kicking off our fundraise and we want you to be a partner. And I remember just this like sinking feeling in this moment of being like, I don't, I feel out of place. I don't know if this is what I actually want, but I had to like put on that face and just like play along. And a few months later, I was driving in New Zealand with my wife. We took a big trip before we were going to have kids, and that was always on the bucket list. And just driving around New Zealand for 2 weeks is just kind of sitting with this feeling that had just been festering. And I get home from the trip, and I walked in and I resigned. And my partners were really shocked, and they're like, "What are you going to do?" And I was like, "I have no idea." And that really kicked off really what I believe is a 5-year journey to kind of figure out who I am and what I want to what I want to be about.
Yeah. Well, I want to ask you some more questions about that before we talk about your journey and what you are
Yeah.
about.
Yeah.
Um, did you have hesitations? I get the sinking feeling, I think, and I really like, I've been there, but did you have thoughts like, oh, but this is, an important gig or something I put a lot in and it's kind of could be exciting. Did you have, how did you, because it feels like you just made this very courageous decision to hear that inner voice, but I'd love to hear if there was anything else going through your mind because I couldn't have been an easy decision.
Well, I had been unhappy for a while, and so my wife was privy to this, and the thing that always kept me coming back was It's a very prestigious job, high visibility, high power. I was raised by a single mother. We didn't grow up with a lot of money that, obviously had a potential to create a lot of wealth. And so naturally, those were some of the things that kept me in it. And, oh, well, this is something you're good at. You've spent the better part of two decades kind of getting to this point, the point that people work, literally I worked years to get to, and then was just like, yeah, I don't really think this is me. And so there was like a little bit of this internal war, this tug of war for a while, until it was like, yeah, this is the right decision, even though I'm going to step into the unknown.
Yeah, well, I've one of the guests who's I've recorded a conversation with her for the podcast. Her name is Maggie Jackson, and she just wrote a book called Uncertain, and it's all about embracing the unknown and uncertainty.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear you share kind of almost like tactically how you embrace that, because uncertainty and unknown are scary. It doesn't matter who we are, right? The brain goes into overdrive. It's survival based. It wants to keep us safe. So what did you do, and how did you, I guess, internally think about this journey that you were embarking? Were you intentional, like, oh, I'm going to go on a journey of self-discovery?
Not at all. Not
Oh,
at all. In a lot of ways, I was very naive, and I leapt before I had a plan, if I'm being completely honest. And I mean, that's, and we can talk about it, but that's a big reason why I decided to start Downshift after all these years, is because I navigated this liminal space, this uncertain, mysterious territory for years. And sure, I was like training to be a coach and had support, but I mean, I was really left to my own devices. And so it's interesting. It almost took like, I was on a 6-month paid sabbatical. So I was like still getting paid and like working on the boards of the companies that I had invested in and supporting those founders. And then it was October of 2017. And then I left. And there was like a 6-month period where I was like depressed, not depressed, like literally my wife was like, you could not get out of bed. I didn't know what to do with myself. I had no plans every day. I just kind of like was going through the motions. And that was the experience that eventually I'm like, I have to make a decision to get out of this sense of stuckness. And so it was just like, I'm going to make a decision. And a friend of mine ran, multiple friends of mine ran actually one of the best venture firms in New York. And they're like, why don't you be a venture partner? You can coach half the time and like advise us and support us. And I was like, that's actually a good middle ground. It kind of keeps one foot in the old world, but allows me to step more fully into the new world. And I did that for almost 18 months, where I was like coach and still like quasi investor. And after 18 months, it just became so clear that I wanted nothing to do with the venture business anymore.
yeah. Well, there's a couple of threads I want to pull on there. One is, you said you took a leap before you had a plan. I just want to share with you, and for our listeners, in the interest of being really honest, one of my life mantras is leap before you think.
Yep.
And I used to actually judge myself for doing this, because I've always done it. And my first job out of college was at McKinsey, a super coveted consulting firm. And I left before my 2 years were up and angered everyone at the firm. And I left as one of the top analysts. And I just got excited about the startup, and then imploded 6 months later. And I did that a lot. And I used to judge myself, but I actually think, Steve, and I just would love for you to talk more about it. I think there is actually wisdom in that, I think it's very easy. I work with a lot of leaders and awesome humans who get paralyzed by over planning or overthinking, and then they can't
Yeah.
figure it out and they don't make a move. And I'm not even talking about leaving your job, even within a company, looking for a different role or expanding. And so I'd love for you to actually talk about how you found that to be in your process. Kind of, is there this balance between planning and sometimes maybe needing to take a leap?
Yeah. Yes. I mean, we can talk very specifically about what I call embodied experiments, which is
Let's talk about it. Go for it.
what happens when we make contact with reality. So, through my long winding journey, I don't believe that I'm an independent, isolated actor moving through the world. I view that we are very much in a symbiotic relationship with our environment and with the people in the environment and the space and the things we're learning and engaging with. And if we're willing to actually, like, I'll use the word slow down and connect more deeply while we're engaging with reality, we can begin to feel in our bodies whether something is energizing and resonating versus draining and depleting. And so what's interesting, and here's I'll come back to, I think that the point that I really wanted to make was, and this is something that I've had since a young age, which is this kind of like inner knowing when something feels off.
Hmm.
And the thing that let me move forward without a plan, without an answer, was this like deep knowing. And there's some people that call it like out of integrity or out of alignment, but I just did I just knew there was like a deep inner knowing that like words couldn't even describe. I just knew it wasn't the right thing for me. And so what I work with my clients now as part of Downshift is, how do you kind of begin to feel in to when you know that something isn't right, and move towards that thing that you're really longing for and wanting to call into your life.
Yeah, and I think that's such a beautiful way to articulate it. And um, I think, Steve, and I'd love your perspective on this. I actually think this knowing is something we all have, and it's just
Me
some of
too.
us are attuned to it, like you were. I was not for a very long time. I, grew up in a very loving, but very intellectual, very cerebral family in the Soviet Union. My father's a scientist, and the spirituality, religion, even the word embodiment, this just wasn't part of the beingness
Sure.
of us. And I didn't have this knowing. In fact, I was, I like to say I lived from the neck up. Like I would, just intellectually approaching life. And it wasn't for me until I burnt out that I think that was actually a wake up call from life, from universe, whatever you want to call it, this collaborative partner that we have. I feel the same way, where I had to learn probably what you teach your clients of to hear that other voice, not the rational voice of here are the pros and the cons, and here's a smart thing to do, and here, but this feeling. And so I think it's really beautiful the work you're doing because you're someone who could hear it from a young age. But I do think, I wonder what you think about that. I think we all have that voice. It's just a matter of learning how to hear it or sense it.
Well, here's what I will say is I lost it. So when I was younger, like like kid, like, child to teenager, I had it. And then eventually I got on the hamster wheel and the treadmill. And what happened is I started using substances daily to kind of numb emotional pain and trauma that I had from earlier in life. And so for me, I was a highly functioning addict. I was smoking weed every single day and drinking, like never identified as an alcoholic, but definitely drank more than the average person. And what's interesting is exactly 10 years ago, I was on vacation in France for my brother-in-law's wedding, and I got served an ad for The Power of Now by Eckhart Tolle, literally magically, like one of the Amazon ads in the
Yeah.
store. And I'm like, I have my Kindle on me. I'm going to download it. And I downloaded the book and read it in like a week. And it just knocked me on my ass. And I came home from that vacation and immediately texted a friend and said, you have a meditation practice. I want to learn. How can I learn? And she said, you won't even guess this. My teacher and friend is actually coming in from the West Coast for the next week. And there was just that first synchronicity where I'm like, what are the chances? And I
Mm-hmm.
sat with that teacher and learned the technique. And then that kind of started my consciousness journey 10 years ago. And it wasn't until like 3 years later, or 2.5 years later, when I finally decided to quit. But there was a 2-year period where I was sitting and getting still and able to listen to that inner voice without any of the substances and distractions to get me to move away from it.
Well, I think it's so powerful, and I so appreciate you sharing that so openly, Steve. I think we all have our numbing substances. For me, it wasn't drugs. I did probably drink too much red wine, but it wasn't even that. For me, it was my numbing substance was achievement. That
Mhm.
is how I numbed. There was one time in my life, speaking of venture capital, so I was in venture capital earlier than you, and then I got out of it to be in tech. But we were living in New York City. I was at a venture capital firm, and on the side, started a publishing company with my husband Avi. Not wrote a book, but started a publishing company out of our illegal one bedroom sublet. Had a daughter, Mia, and after she was born, I had 3 months maternity leave. And I remember this moment so clearly. Here she was in the bouncy seat, and the only way she would be quiet if you rocked her with your foot violently.
Mm.
The buzzing was clearly not enough. So I was doing this with one foot. I was on a board call for one of my companies because I was afraid the partners at my firm would fire me. I was the only woman if I didn't still work on maternity leave. And with my right hand, I was editing one of the manuscripts for this publishing company. And I remember this feeling of like, I can't go forward. And literally, like the overachiever kicked in was like, yes, you can. But actually, in retrospect, that's how I numb myself. So I just share this in the spirit of just being open. I think we all have these numbing mechanisms to stay busy, to stay distracted, to literally numb through substance. And I'd love for you to talk about, and of course, this is the work you're now doing. Um, Talk about the challenges that we face slowing down and getting quiet. I read something, I'm sure you've seen it, but I read something that it was a study done of just what kind of physical pain people would endure just so they wouldn't be left alone with their thoughts. Like people preferred
Yeah.
electric shock.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, quickly before I dive into that question,
Yeah.
a good friend of mine, Alex Olshansky, very close friend, has written about what he calls modern addiction, which are all of these forms of numbing and disassociating that are effectively socially acceptable. So shopping, consumerism, phones, work, and that you know he argues that most people have what a modern addiction as a way to not have to get to the heart of your question, not have to sit with your thoughts.
I'm gonna
and
have to
and
look
that
him up because I agree wholeheartedly.
yeah, and for a lot of people that's a scary proposition, especially when they slow down and they have to be with their thoughts. It's actually work with a lot of leaders and teaching of meditation and mindfulness. And the thing that we often hear is like when they start, I can't do it. And I'll be like, what do you mean you can't do it? And he said, well, I sit down and I've tried it. I've tried all the apps and it's just my thoughts. Like I can't ever get calm. And I think the reason why I bring this up is, most people think that their thoughts are a bug, that there's something wrong with them because they can't quiet their mind. But in reality, it's just the conditioning, and it's the habit nature of the mind. The mind is going to run if you let it run. And what we find is if we're willing to hold those thoughts and slow down and be with them and begin to disidentify with them, it creates that space. And in that space, you can find that clarity and that knowing. And so, what we often say is yes, you have to be willing to face your thoughts and sometimes your shadow and really, really painful stuff. But underneath it all is that deeper knowing, is that clarity.
Yeah, and I think I think I just wrote about this on LinkedIn because I lead this small group mentorship program for women leaders called Unleashing Aliveness, and we just had our last
Love it.
session.
Love it.
And one of the women shared, she said, and I've known her, so I knew her from before, but she said, I just want to share a giant aha with everyone. She
Mm.
was taking a career sabbatical when she started because she was really burnt out in her previous job. And she said one of her intentions for the program was not to force the answer. She's always been like me. What's next? What's next? Two things at a time. Got to figure it out. And she said, I'm going to try to not do that. I'm going to try to be in the unknowing and just go on this journey. And she said in the session yesterday, she said, I was having a conversation with my husband and all of a sudden I had the clarity. And she said, I know exactly what I want to do and I'm so excited about it. And it's precisely because she didn't force it. It's because she allowed the space, which was not comfortable. And I'd love for you to talk about that, because one of the things I find when people ask me about my experience, they were like, oh, so you took this 2-year journey. Was it like really fun? And no, it was not fun. It was uncomfortable. And I had a lot of shame about it, that I'm not the overachiever Nataly. And so I'm not sure the opposite of discomfort is comfort. I think it's skill. I think it's
Yeah.
skillfully learning. So I'd love for you to talk about, like, for someone listening to this and they're all in right now, they're like, yes, Steve, that sounds great. How? Other than signing up for Downshift, which I'd love for you to talk about, like, how? I'm this busy executive or salesperson or, entrepreneur. How do I have to quit? That's a question I
Mhm.
often get.
Yeah. Well, I think it depends. I think it really depends. And this is something I say to my clients is that context matters. So the question is what's the structure of your life? Does your life even allow you to consider quitting? Because, I'm a white cisgendered male, very privileged. I had some savings where I was able to take a leap. I wasn't able to retire, I wasn't even close to it. But like I had enough where, yeah, I could take a risk. But not everyone has that luxury. And so the first thing I'll say is like, if you have the ability to quit, is that the right thing for you from the standpoint of checking in with your body? Are you burnt out? Are you depleted? Do you have anything in the tank? And and to me, I think it is about checking in with yourself. And if you can't leave your job, then it's about, okay, well, then what are the small experiments that I want to begin to run, knowing that the situation that I'm in right now isn't going to be the thing that I'm spend the next 10 years of my life doing, but what are the things that I can start to feel into? Like what am I attracted to? What do I dream about? What do I value? And like begin to find the breadcrumbs, or, as one of my mentors says, the thread, and begin to pull on that thread and see where it takes you.
Hmm. I think that's really powerful advice. One of the things, I call this podcast reinventability, and it's a word I made up. And for me, it encapsulates this ability that we all have to envision a better future and grow through change and take action to make it happen. Um, uh, we don't have to burn it all down.
Yeah, we
Right?
don't.
We don't. And so I'd love for you to talk about um, a bunch of things. But first, I'd love for you to share about Downshift and kind of how your journey within yourself then led you to this place of, oh, this is possible for others. Because that's what happened for me. I realized, wait, this, like you, this very awkward thing that I just did because I had no plan. I just sort of, I read neuroscience and I took Buddhism classes and I just put it together. That's how my first book came about. I said, wait, hold on. I created a method. Let me share it. So I'd love for you to share that part of your journey. And then I want to talk to you about ambition and slowing down, because this is the biggest objection that I hear from high performance, awesome humans.
Yeah. So the first thing I would say is to answer the first question. So this was so for the audience to know, when I started coaching, I started my training in 2017 in that sabbatical, and started coaching CEOs and investors. That was like my first, the whether if you want to use a business term, that was like the first market that I went into, because I knew it really well. It's who I invested in, and it were a lot of my peers. And that was actually great for a long time. I mean, up until 2021, so almost like 4 years, I was coaching these executives, right? These high powered CEOs and investors. What started to happen is people would come to me and say, hey, I'm a founder going through Y Combinator. I raised a bunch of money for my business. My company's a shit show. I have conflict with my co-founders, and I can't do this anymore. Can you help me? Your transition was so public. Can you help me think through it? And so I took on this client. I had another executive, repeat serial founder who was working for a big public company being like, I'm making $1 million a year, but I'm using 20% of my brain and I'm going to kill myself. And so what started to happen is people just organically started reaching out to me because I was very public about my story. And what I began to feel into was, oh, these people are going through something similar that I was over the last 4 years. And then I started actually coaching more of these people. And with enough time, I was like, oh, I actually want to spend all my time working with high performers in transition. Because for me, the thing that really got me excited about this is A, I didn't have that support when I made the decision to take that leap. And what I realized is in the business context, they only want to talk about business and strategy and for me, I wanted to talk, like, really focus on the whole person. And so much more was possible in these conversations. And so that's what got me really excited. And frankly, Downshift is the company that I wish I had had access to in 2017. And I started doing my one-on-one coaching for people in transition 2021. And then in the spring, we launched our first decelerator cohort, a decelerator program, which I'm happy to go into details on, like what the kernel of that idea was. And it was super successful. And we're going to launch the next cohort in the next few weeks. Well, in terms of applications, and then it will launch in early October of this year.
It's fantastic, and it's been fantastic to watch. So, speaking of high performers, I'd love for you to talk about slowing down and ambition. It's a question that I often get when I've written a couple books sharing my journey from refugee to giant success to total burnout to, completely changing what I do and reinventing what I do. And the question I often get is, well, Nataly, it seems like you're still really ambitious. It doesn't make sense. And so before I share my thoughts, I'd love for you to talk about, is that antithetical? Can you be someone who's slowing down? Do you have to give up your ambition? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I don't think it's the case. So I can only speak. I can speak to my experience, and then those of who I work with. In my experience, I lost all my ambition. It literally vanished. So I went from being a VC to then being a coach, kind of having an identity crisis of sorts, and being like, yeah, I want to be a good coach and drive outcomes and provide value and just be a thought support partner. And I didn't want to set the world on fire. I didn't want to spend my time on Twitter writing tweet threads. Like it evaporated. And I'm like, I don't know what's wrong with me. I've been one of the most ambitious people, and now it's gone. And there was almost like a 2-year period where I didn't have any ambition. And it was disorienting until I finally had the idea for Downshift. And what I'm realizing as I build this company is that I can still have a sort of a downshift mentality and deeply intentional while also building a company and going through cycles of upshift and downshift, upshift and downshift. So I don't think of them as mutually exclusive. I view it as like the yin and the yang, as like complementary. And that when we actually come back to ourselves and connect, like we know what we need in a given moment. And so we launched our decelerator program in the spring, April, and the 3 months leading up to it, it was, pre-launch, like gotta launch a program, gotta fill a class, build a curriculum. And I was very much into that upshift. But what I started to notice were all of these old tendencies and like kind of like what some people call like dirty energy.
Mm.
that it's like, really like dirty
Mhm.
ambition, like fueled by the ego.
Yeah.
And then eventually I'm like, oh, I know this pattern. This is so familiar because I knew it. I lived it for so long. And then I'm like, oh, I need to reorient. And so I just want to make that point. Going back to whether someone has to give up their ambition to embrace this, I don't think that's the case. I see it as like a recalibration where it's I've been going so hard for so long and along the way changing and maybe not even realizing all the ways that I've changed. And by slowing down, allows us to again connect to, I think, hopefully a cleaner source of ambition and fuel and energy. I wrote a piece on my newsletter where the road bends called Rethinking Ambition almost 2 years ago. And what I said is like ambition in the coming off of COVID and even kind of in this stage of like late stage capitalism can be a dirty word. Like
Yes.
it's
Yes. I
like
think
and
ambition got a bad rep.
it did. And
Yeah.
the New York Times wrote, I mean, it was everywhere about like questioning ambition. And I questioned ambition too, as I said. Now, what I've come to determine is actually ambition can be really good.
Mm.
And it can be a motivating force. And I think where there's an opportunity, and I called it holistic ambition, which is what happens when we form a new relationship with that word. And because we live in a capitalist society, we tend to equate ambition with work, with achievement, with outcomes. And to me, I'm like, well, what would it look like to be ambitious about giving care to your parents, your sick and aging parents? What would it look like to be ambitious about volunteering in your community and building a community? And so to me, I think there's ways to continue to be ambitious in other areas of our lives while we're recalibrating in the work domain.
I think that's a really beautiful way to think about it. My experience with ambition, just to share, like you, I think for a lot of my life until I kind of hit this breaking point, which in my case, I don't know about you, I feel like it was the universe coming and hitting me with a 2x4 because he was the only way to slow me down. It really had to stop me because I ignored all the other previous invitations.
Yeah.
Um, uh, so I definitely, I would say that my ambition, the way that I think about it, it was all coming from a place of should.
Mm.
And, hey, I came here as a refugee. We came with nothing. I have this amazing opportunity. I'm a fairly smart, capable person. I should have this amazing career and I should build a bunch of companies. And that we can, whatever we want to call it, that is surface level, that is ego based, that is not authentic ambition. And uh, I don't think I had true ambition. And my true ambition now, I feel fairly ambitious. I equate it to having a huge sense of purpose. I feel very
Mm.
compelled to bring my lessons learned to as many people as I can
I
because
love
I
that.
feel like I found water in the desert and I just want to. So I'm pretty ambitious about that. I started this podcast because I was like, "Ooh, that's another way to get this into people." And so I feel it's purposeful, ambitious, or authentic.
Mm.
And I think as you're talking about, and also I think the point you bring up that it's not just about work, right? That we can, again, in America, we're addicted to work in many ways. And this is something I'm working on. But to bring it into other areas of our life, I'd love for you to talk about, from your experience and from others, I connected to ambition is, as I just said, for me, it's about purpose. And I have a lot of people that I work with or I speak to, and they come up and they say, Nataly, I'm not sure. I don't know what my purpose is. I don't know. And I'd love for you to talk about how you think about that because just to share my experience, a big part of my burnout had nothing to do with doing too much work. I was doing too much work, but I do a lot of work now and I'm not burnt out. I'm quite full. It
Yeah.
was coming from completely being disconnected from like who I was and also what was actually meaningful to me. So it was the
Mm.
should be meaningful to me. So I'd love for you to
Yeah.
talk about that.
Yeah, that I deeply can relate to that based on my own experience, and the shoulds often are what we internalize from the messages that we're given to by our family, by our peers, by the industry that and the culture that we operate in. And so anytime I hear or should, my antenna automatically goes up and starts to be like, oh, well, I wonder where you got that from. And that's something we actually explore. We have a whole module on ambition and money. And so, but I want to answer that question directly. Again, I work with a lot of people on this. For me, what I've experienced around ambition and specifically purpose was that I almost had to let my ego die, because the previous purpose, whether you look at like my first coaching practice, which was called high output, and to like help maximize the potential of founders and leaders, or like manifest their wildest visions or boldest visions. And investing was also driven by ego, right? Pursuit of money, and I was buying into this narrative that was given to me by society in terms of what was valued, what would get me a pat on the back. Now, and something that we do in our program is, to me, it's when you feel this connection to something bigger than yourself. And for some, that never happens. And for some, it takes a long time. But when we start to really allow our ego to go through a death, which often can happen in the liminal space, where it's like, I give up, I surrender, I'm done. And being open to, and so for me, like Downshift is like a great example. Previously to Downshift, a lot of it was ego driven. And now I've like so connected to a problem that's way bigger than me, that impacts so many people, that I'm like, I can actually get behind this. And rather than, my old tendency would be just to like, I have a purpose, it's a big idea. I had people emailing me literally every day to like join the team, be a part of it, join the program, work with me. And I'm like, I'm actually going to take my time with it, because if the purpose is clean, this is something I'm going to work on for the next decade. And so let's be methodical, let's be thoughtful. So I think, like, to me, what I help people is like, can we connect to a purpose that's more from we consciousness versus the me consciousness?
And that is so, I can hear it in your voice, and I think our listeners can hear it. That is empowering. And I mean that in a very literal sense of that word, figurative. That is actually empowering, because what is purpose, right? Purpose is when what we do contributes to something bigger than ourselves and bigger than this moment, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's helping someone cross the street, that's purpose, or finishing your presentation for your team, that's purpose, if it contributes to them in a meaningful way. And so I love that kind of we perspective. Yeah, I'm going to think about that. That's really from the we consciousness. I think that's really powerful. Okay, let's talk a little bit about, you keep using this term, which I think I know what it means, but I want you to talk about this liminal space. What is that?
Yeah, so the liminal space, I don't know who coined it, but there's a lot of people that have written about it. William Bridges in the book Transition, Arnold van Gennep, the sociologist or anthropologist, the Dutch anthropologist that came up with the term, like rite of separation, rite of passage, that studied indigenous cultures. But to just get to the heart of the question, the liminal space is the space between what the space that you previously occupied and the space that you're going to occupy. Said a different way, it's when you are not who you used to be, but you're not who you're going to be, and having to sit with that. And in that liminal space is darkness, death, mystery, chaos, word you used earlier, uncertainty. And how does our society generally do with these things, especially if you're a high performer that's used to like blunt forcing your way through problems? And what most people come to find is, in this liminal space, you can't think your way out of it. You can't plan your way through it. It's a space that needs to be experienced and almost let it do its work on you to then come through it as a new person. You know, to use that metaphor that a lot of people use, is it's the cocoon. And
Yeah.
and and in the cocoon, as the imaginal cells go to work and they turn the body of the caterpillar into a goop, into literally nothingness that has a butterfly programmed into it. Well, the liminal space is that goop. That's the
Yeah,
goop.
Goop. I nicknamed it. I remember years ago, I don't know why, I started calling it the Goop. It was easier, I think, to say that the Goop. And yes, I've used that analogy quite a bit. I think that's a beautiful way to describe it. And don't you find it interesting that being in that space, I think for so many people, like hearing your story, so many people, it's often a really transformative experience. And we go through it, it's not once and done. It's something, I believe, just like caterpillar butterfly, it's a cycle, right?
Yeah.
Um, so it's such a uh, essential experience to being alive, and yet so difficult and so challenging. And I often think about just that dichotomy, that it is so essential to really like living out our highest purpose, and yet one of the hardest places to stay in. You know,
Yeah.
I went through it last year for very different reasons, but last year for me, I was in the goo. Everything felt stuck. My business was stuck. I didn't want to talk about the same things anymore.
Mm.
I felt I was betraying my community because I want to talk about new things. I was in this goo. It was awful. It was a really hard year.
Yeah.
And I resisted it because I think we resist first. We just resist, and I hung on, and finally let it be. And you know the punchline without knowing the facts. It's when I allowed myself to really be in it, then all of a sudden, but not all of a sudden, it just seems all of a sudden, the butterfly wings. You know, it's funny. We're looking at my painting behind me, which is kind
I
of
love
like
it. Yeah.
imagine sort of abstract butterflies. But all this new wave came out of me, this whole idea that what I want to focus in my next decade is helping to people to reinvent into the future self they really love. But I had to be in that darkness. So can you talk, like, I just imagine a lot of people listening, it's not a place anyone wants to be. Can you give some insight on how we can approach it, I guess, with a bit more acceptance and maybe even, dare I say, enthusiasm?
Yeah. Well, the word that's coming to mind as I feel into you or tune into you, Nataly, is like self-compassion.
That's right.
And I would do a lot of work with my clients around inner critic
No.
and perfectionist and a range of other parts that make it really hard for us to slow down, that create a lot of resistance. And to me, at the heart of this is, how do we like come back to ourselves and talk to ourselves? As I forget who said this, but self-compassion is the way we would talk to a friend in
Yeah,
need.
Kristen Neff, her work is really,
Kristen Neff, right?
self-compassion is on
Exactly.
there. Yeah, I
Yeah,
think she said that.
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so for me, and I work with men on this, and women, of course, but like, can you feel your situation emotionally? Like, what's present? Is it fear? Is it grief? Can we allow ourselves to feel that and bring them in? Can you feel it? And then, and I learned this from the Hoffman process also, that uses Kristen's work. But then, are you the only one in the world that feels this way,
Mm.
that's experiencing this? Right. And then how can I give myself what it is that I need? Something that I ask my clients all the time is, I'll say, okay, take 3 breaths. So we'll take 3 breaths together, take 3 breaths, and I'll say, tune into your body. What does your body need right now?
Mm.
And with even the most heady people will be like, oh, I need to go to bed early, or I really need to slow down this week, or I need to eat. I need to eat better food, or I need exercise. And so like these practices are all about like the self-compassion and giving ourselves what we need in these really chaotic times. Another thing, just quickly, that I talk about in the program, and I've written about this, is what I call like the through lines, which are like, what are the things that are unchanging in your life that can be grounding for you? So it could be a hobby, it could be a ritual, taking a bubble bath every night with candles by your side. It could be creative expression and painting, But what are those things that are going to be unchanging, that feel safe and familiar and grounding in these really turbulent times?
I think that's it's really beautiful advice. I remember I had a mentor that I met about a year into my really dark time still. And I worked with her for a very long time. Janet, I've written about her, I think, in both of my books. And I remember the first time she mentioned self-compassion, I had this reaction of like, oh my, what? No, And I remember, I think I literally wrote about this in the book. I responded to that by giving her a really long laundry list of all the reasons I did not deserve it. I was like, no, let me explain. And I'll never forget, she was just this very kind, soft human. And she just sat there and gave me this soft, kind smile because I was making my own point. Self-compassion isn't something you deserve. If my daughter, Mia, she doesn't deserve my compassion. She doesn't have to deserve my love. She has it. She could be annoying as heck. She could be doing stuff that's driving me crazy. It doesn't remove my love and compassion for her. And yet when we look at ourselves, right, we remove that. I think it's such a beautiful component. So in every episode, Steve, I ask my guest a question that has come from a listener. I have this very vibrant community and they have lots of questions. And I wrote down a few that I thought I would ask you, and I'm trying to pick, but we'll go with this. I'll kind of blend them together. A lot of people, and I feel maybe it's because I'm doing a lot more small group mentorship, so I hear from people a lot versus just being on a big stage. We're in a moment of a lot of change and uncertainty. I mean, pick the area: AI, climate,
war in the Middle
social,
East,
political war. I mean,
Russia.
Exactly. Pick, and just a lot of change. And it's very unsettling. And I get a lot of questions, and I'm going to blend them into one of, I feel like there is something more for me, but I don't know what that is. And I am afraid, or I have fear around, amidst all this unsettling around me, I have fear about how to go about figuring that out. So I wonder if you could talk about that.
Yeah. The word that's coming to mind, because I was reading a passage in a series of poems related to this topic, but longing, not belonging, longing. And what is it that you're really longing for in your life? And not as in necessarily like an intellectual question that you journal on once and you're done with it. But it's like, what is it that I just really, really want for myself? What is it that, and it's this question that, as Rainier, as Rilke said, the poet, where this is a question that you sit in, and you let the question do its work on you versus trying to do your work on the question. And to me, what we start to feel into is like that thing that we're longing for. It's almost like following the beat of a drum, or the heartbeat of life, and starting to move towards it. It could even be like a golden thread that you see like shimmers of in the distance. You can't really make it out, but it's there from time to time. And what I would say is that, like, there is a sense of trust and faith, but if you're connected to that beat of your heart, and that thing that's wanting to pull you forward, is just be patient and sit with it
Mm.
and start to move towards it when you have the self-compassion and you're able to work with whatever the resisting resisting forces are.
And I think also you mentioned this before a couple of times of I'd love for you to describe what that could be like, these embodied experiments, because I'm a big fan of one thing I brought into my work from my techie days is I often have people do a 2 week sprint where I say, okay, forget about figuring out the big picture. For the next 2 weeks, commit to taking one action every day that feels aligned to where you want to
Yeah.
go. And every day, like, so talk about it because I love this idea of experiments. What are embodied experiments that like someone like in this place could
Yeah,
do?
like let me give you an example. It could be as simple as, I'm really interested in becoming a doula. This is fresh because a friend of mine came to me and be like, I think I want to be a doula. But like, let's imagine, and she said, but I know nothing about doula other than, I hired one to help me with the birth of my first child. And so it's like, okay, well, what would be a mini experiment for you to run? And could be go watch a video on YouTube or go read a book or go find a doula to talk to. And while you're engaging in that, can you be conscious to your experience? Are you more attracted to it? Do you find yourself leaning in? Are you energized? Are you depleted? Are you nervous? Are you questioning whether you could actually go ahead and do this? Are you already fast forwarding, thinking of all the ways in which this won't work? But what we'll say is like, just take that first step. And there's a term that I love using called the adjacent possible, which is a concept created by or derived by Stuart Kaufman of the Santa Fe Institute, later popularized by Stephen Johnson, of where great ideas come from is the name of the book. I might be mispronouncing it, but it's like this idea of like the way innovation happens isn't like, oh, I have an idea and now it's possible. It's oftentimes innovations are built off of other innovations, other insights. It's like the iPhone wouldn't have been possible without the chip and the battery technology and GPS, and all these things had to come together. And I view these experiments as very similar, where we take a step forward and we have a new understanding of ourselves. We understand, is something like resonating deeply? Is it energizing? Are we more attracted to it? And then, oh, okay, like let's take another step. The Buddha taught that there were 10,000 doors to the Dharma.
Yeah. Yeah.
10,000. And the idea isn't to pick the perfect one. It's just to pick the first one. And the
Yeah.
brave heart takes that step forward, and let's see what unfolds and what doors open. And okay, I'm going to take the next step.
Yeah. And I love because I think a really key thing, and this brings us back to where we started, and take a leap before you have a plan. Take a leap and pay attention. I think
Yeah.
this is a lot of what you've been saying is it's not just about taking a leap. And that I think for me is the difference between the leaps I used to take and the leaps I take now. I still take leaps because I it's who I am, but I pay attention. Before I would just
Well,
take leaps.
completely. And what just got me excited is it's actually the kernel of the idea of the decelerator program was, you had all these accelerators that help people, build companies, become creators, accelerate their careers, and none help people slow down. And to me, when you're in an accelerator program, it's sort of like one track mind. There's a very specific objective, and I'm off in doing it. And so, this allows you to leap, but with more intention, to leap with more presence and awareness.
Yeah, I think it's beautiful. I remember, I just want to share with you. I remember when you shared it, I guess on Twitter. I don't spend that much time there, but I think on
Yeah.
Twitter. And I just read that and I like smiled. I really cheered for you from a place of really having been there and understanding. I think it's uh such a necessary and such a beautiful like yin yang to that. Because I do think there are times in our lives where we need an accelerator.
Yeah, me
and we
too.
need the activator. It's really important.
Yeah.
And there are times in our life where we need to decelerate. We need to
Yeah.
downshift. So what a gift you're giving to the world, Steve.
And,
I really
and
mean that.
thank you. And I feel that I'm in the cycle. I'm in the part of the cycle where I'm ready to accelerate, and and but I'm coming at it now with a whole new set of skills and resources and capabilities that I never had before. They were always in me, but I needed to do the work to really create this new way of being.
Yeah. And I just think to tie it back to our conversation on ambition, I think it's kind of connected because like people have asked me, am I afraid of burning out again? I'm not, because it has nothing to do, burnout doesn't have to do with ambition or working too much. It has to do with feeling connected to ourselves. So I know
It's
now,
hard.
yeah, I know I can feel when I'm reaching that place where I don't want to be. I have awareness, and then I have the tools and the compassion to say, this is what I need to do. And that's the giant difference. So I love
Yeah,
that.
how beautiful.
Yeah, no, Steve, look, this conversation is a
I know we
giant
could talk for another hour easily.
Well, I think we may.
Yeah,
I think it's something I'd love to do, but it's a gift for me. It's a gift for everyone listening. And I just want to tell you how grateful I am, not just for your insights, but for the warmth with which you share them. I think it
thank you.
is, like, I feel the genuineness of what you're sharing. And I'm sure people who don't see us feel as well. I think it's one of the biggest gifts that we can give is to be truly ourselves. And I think you are. And thank you. And we'll put the link to learn more about Downshift and Steve
Amazing.
in the show notes as
Great.
usual. And with that, thank you for being here. And I always say to our listeners, thank you for being open to what you've heard. And if you heard something that resonated, please rate and review this podcast. We are new. It'll help people find the podcast. And be an awesome, kind human. If there's someone in your life who you feel is in a place that they would appreciate hearing what we talked about, please share this with them, as well as share Downshift if you think it's relevant for them. So thank you all. That's all we have for today. And I will see and be in your ear for our next episode.